gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, if I may, what are some of the connections between the Johannine Gospel, Johannine, John's fourth Gospel, and in what ways does your work in mimesis criticism show some connections to the synoptics when it comes to this whole discussion?
Well, that's a great question, Derek. And it requires a little more background. Many people have thought that you can use John either as the earliest of the Gospels or as an independent verification of the truthfulness of the synoptic narratives, because you have lots of overlapping stories between the two, or that they use a common source as an alternative to the Q hypothesis that some people have argued that John and Mark have overlapping content because of a common source. But if one grants that the Gospel of Mark imitates the Homeric epics, that whole argument falls apart. The Gospel of John, in its earliest manifestation and perhaps in its last, knows the Synoptic Gospels because the same Homeric imitations appear in the Gospel of John. This is most obvious probably in the Passion narrative and all of the events that lead up to it. But we also have the Johannine version of the triumphal entry. We have the stilling of the storm and the feeding of the 5,000 and other miracle stories that have Homeric backgrounds to them. So John knows the synoptics. And another reason for suggesting it comes from Papias. Papias quotes John the Elder, who seems to have been the author of the Johannine epistles. And at several points, John is evoking gospel texts that seem to reflect Matthew. Throughout the Johannine tradition, apparently these synoptic gospels were available, and only later did you have a composition of the Gospel of John. Now, one of the peculiarities is that all of these parallels, all of them, to the Gospel of Mark, appear in the Dionysian Gospel, one might say, passages where Jesus is depicted much like Dionysus. And scholars have known for a long time that the Gospel of John is the result of a compositional stratigraphy. That is, there are various levels of composition. And for your viewers, I'd like to talk about my view of the Gospel of John as an excavation, going from the most recent version, the canonical version of the Gospel, then boring down to the next level, and finally to the bottom level. I view the Gospel of John like an Indian pueblo, where you have one building that sits on another building that sits on another building, and archaeologists have to deal with this building before they can deal with this building, before they deal with this building. The final version of the Gospel of John clearly has something to do with the epilogue in chapter 21. There are lots of reasons for it. One is the quite clear double doxology or postscript in the two. Chapter 20 ends like it should be the end of a book, and then you have another chapter and another postscript. Also, in the epilogue, it's clear that the beloved disciple is the hero, and he has died, and it's caused something of a crisis for the community. and that the community recognizes the leadership of Peter, so that Peter is the one who is going to guide Jesus' flock. Every reference to the beloved disciple in the fourth gospel apparently comes out of this last redaction. And this has been shown by Martin Hengel and others, that you have this, what I call the beloved disciple gospel. And it may have been created in order to draw a bridge between the Gospel of John and 1 John, because 1 John begins, that which we have seen and heard and touched, we deliver on to you, his congregation. And even in antiquity, people saw that to be a reference to the gospel, what we have seen and touched and so on. There's a segue between 1 John and 2 John, 2 John and 3 John, and 3 John ends with, I have more things to say to you. And then we have the Apocalypse of John, in which you have a John who writes to the 7 churches. He's in exile, and he fulfills the promise of the end of 3 John that he has more things to write to him. And so you have this, what's called a Johannine corpus, that begins with a gospel, goes to epistles, and then ends with an apocalypse. Does that sound like the organization of the New Testament? That begins with it, the New Testament begins with Gospels, goes to epistles, and ends with the Apocalypse of John. But quite apart from that, we find another layer that is viciously hostile against Jews. There are 3 indications that the Johannine Christians have been excommunicated from the synagogues, and they are very bitter about it. And this level is where we find the most hostile treatments of Jews. You are of your father the devil, he was a liar from the beginning. And this polemic, before Abraham was, I am. Jesus is the new Moses. Most of the biblical passages come out of this layer of, but there's nothing in it that's Dionysian. And then we get this other layer that has most of the parallels to the Synoptic Gospels, but it also has the changing of water into wine, the episode of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and he offers her living water. The Eucharist as being Jesus' blood and flesh. Mm-hmm. And also the famous prologue, where it's similar to the prologue of Euripides' Bacchae, and so on. In my view, the Dionysian Gospel was a supplement to the Synoptic Gospels to make Jesus a donor deity like Dionysus. Whereas Jesus says, carry your cross, sell your goods, and follow me, and lay up treasures in heaven, the fourth Gospel in its earliest version makes Jesus like Dionysus, who offers eternal life, who offers wine at a wedding to people who are drunk. Jesus is a party animal in the Gospel of John in a way that he's not in the Synoptics. But in that, so this is the excavation, but now I'm going to rebuild the history of the tradition. In that earlier stratum, which is a kind of supplement to the Gospel, the Synoptic Gospels, there's no criticism of the Jews as a whole. In fact, but it's written for Gentiles, but the Jews are not demonized. In this next level, we find lots of parallels to the Johannine epistles. It's clear that these authors are trying to evoke the elders' teachings, but it becomes hostile against the Jews. It's no longer the chief priests. It's no longer the Pharisees. It's no longer religious leaders. It's the Jews as a whole. And the final edition comes along, and it's irenic. It's trying to make nice. There's no anti-Jewish polemic, even though it inherited all of this anti-Jewish stuff. It accepts that there's a Petrine church. And the final verse basically admits multiple gospels. I guess the whole heavens would have to be a manuscript, in other words, to hold all the things that could be written. But this is what the beloved disciple said, and it's the one that we're basically going to privilege. Now, scholars have in the past teased out these various strands by using literary methods, vocabulary and style and so on. But they've not used mimesis criticism to show that it's the earliest stage and only that stage that has imitations of the Bacchae. It's only in this middle stage that we get heavy imitations of the Johannine epistles. But also, I am a firm believer in social identity theory, and I think I have a methodology for the examination of text that's called social identity criticism. And it's, Derek, it's a very simple methodology. And it can be applied to modern societies, ancient societies. It can be applied to texts. And it just goes like this. All of us live in social in-groups. It can be a religious in-group. It could be an ethnic in-group. It could be a national in-group. And the way in-groups craft their identity is twofold. One, to identify the ideal leader, sometimes called the prototypical leader. So who is it that best embodies the in-group's ideology? One can think of certain Republicans in the United States that would do that for Donald Trump. There are Democrats like myself who might do it for Barack Obama. But we have an identity that identifies the values of the in-group with a leader that we venerate. But even more important than the prototypical leader is the stereotypical outgroup. Who are the enemies? And most in-groups have multiple outgroups. And so you demonize or stereotype the outgroup, and in doing so, you reinforce the values of the in-group. Now, if you look at ancient texts, you can see that the leader of the group differs from book to book to book, and sometimes inside of a book. Is Jesus a teacher? Is he the Messiah? Is he the Lord of the universe, or whatever? So you have these changes.
I was going to say the identity, what you're saying, even Jesus is not even the same per gospel, like we talked about last night.
And sometimes you can see inside the same gospel different Jesuses. So Jesus in the fourth gospel is different in the Dionysian gospel from the things that are added by the second. In other words, he's the Dionysian character. In the second one, he's the polemicist against Jews and establishes these rigid boundaries between Jews and his followers. And in the last one, he's the Mr. Nice Guy that is handing on his authority to the beloved disciple and to Peter, and so on. But you have multiple outgroups. So you can talk about the United States as an in-group that often identifies its president as its stereotypical leader, or other politicians or cultural characters. But its outgroups could be, depending on your group, communism or Afghanistan or Cesar Chavez or whatever. And by establishing these stereotypical outgroups, you ungenerously identify what your values are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
kind of doing a little bit of a reversal there, you can find out what the in-group of the literature is based on who their enemies are.
That's right. You can think of it as looking in a mirror, and you get the mirror image of yourself because the person you're looking at in the mirror is the reverse of yourself.
Right.
So that you get your reflection by seeing the reverse reflection in the mirror. It's very, now with The Dionysian gospel, the first gospel, the bad guys are Pharisees and chief priests, but not Jews as a whole. And even the Samaritans are not bad guys. You move to the next one, it's the Jews who are demonized and stereotyped as children of the devil. Mm-hmm. And so that tells you something about the in-group and their leader. And the last one...
And it may give you dating too, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. And in the last one, you don't have any clarified out-group members, except if it's a part of a corpus. You could say Rome becomes the bad guy because of the apocalypse of John, and fearful of the empire, and so on. So most of the stratification of the Gospel of John has been done on literary grounds, but I think you can do it on social identity grounds for this reason, and you can do it in terms of mimesis. What texts are important to imitate at each stage? And you can do it also in the synoptic Gospels. The enemies in the Gospel of Luke are different from the enemies in Matthew, for example. And you can see this in the Acts of the Apostles, who the bad people are. And so I'm just getting sunlight, right?
Yeah. The sun does come.
But anyway, this gives you... So I'll end it here. The Gospel of John probably has 3 strands, and they're identified in terms of literary features, social identity, and mimesis, what they're imitating. And you can't say that the Gospel of John is independent of the synopsis, because the authors imitate passages in Mark, especially, that already have imitated Homer. So you have Homeric radiation going from the epics to Mark to the Johannine Gospel, and these are not independent traditions. So that's the story.
Thank you, Dr. MacDonald.